funds and is not means tested, while the social welfare, of course, is supported by our tax dollars, is not funded by the beneficiaries, of course, and the benefit is means tested. In the national insurance system in Trinidad and Tobago, many of you would know the minimum pension is $3,000 TT per month, while in the social welfare component, which is the senior citizens pension, it offers a maximum benefit of $3,500 per month. And there's some level of interaction, of course, between the two that maybe will come out during the course of our discussion. But in terms of total benefits paid between the NIS pension and the SEP, they contribute a total of just about $10 billion to the economy in Trinidad and Tobago. And so if we turn our attention just to the National Insurance Board, the NIBTT, of course, total income for FY 2022, the most recent public financial information, you will see that the total income for the National Insurance Board was about $5.8 billion in FY 2022. Of course, contribution income being the most significant at about $4.5 billion received. Benefit expenditure, or total expenditure, if I start with that first, was almost $6 billion. And of course, the most significant contributor to that would be our benefit expenditure at just about $5.7 billion. And so that represents about just over 96% of the total benefit expenditure of the system, with administrative expenditure just being just over $200 million. And I know many of you could see that our benefit expenditure is almost alone is almost on par with the total income that was received as at FY 2022, and that our total income is now not sufficient to cover the total benefit expenditure of the system. And this is the first time that this has happened throughout the history of the NIB in FY 2022. Of course, the main contributor to our benefit expenditure is our retirement benefit. And of course, total retirement benefit expenditure is more than 80% of the total benefit expenditure of the system. And so over the last 25 years, we have seen a significant growth and a significant increase in not only of course, the value of the benefit, but also the number of beneficiaries. So in the year 1997, we had the benefit expenditure was 139 million, and we had just under 37,000 beneficiaries. And 25 years later, in the year 2022, we would now have a benefit expenditure of almost 5 billion, which is, of course, a phenomenal increase. And the number of beneficiaries in the system has quadrupled. And so when we look further, of course, the NIB is mandated by law to do an actuarial review within every 10-year period, within every 5-year period, sorry, within every 5 years. And what we see in the results, of course, the 10th actuarial review, the latest public actuarial review done by the International Labour Organization as of 2016, gives us a picture of some of the key moments we can expect in the fund if the status quo is maintained. And so the review indicated that the system's expenditure would first exceed contribution in the year 2016. Now, that was the start of the projection period, but that situation actually took place for the first time in the year 2013. And the second line of the table on screen, we see that the system's expenditure will first exceed contribution plus investment income in the year 2023, 2024. But for some of you who would have been looking on and paying attention, you would have realized that that happened in FY 2022, 2 years earlier. And of course, the projections indicate that once our assets begin to decrease, then the assets will be exhausted in the year 2035, 2036. And of course, we have been The NIB has been engaging our key stakeholders, of course, in order to, so that we ensure that that does not become a reality. However, if the status quo does remain and that does pan out, what that means, of course, is that there will be a gap between our revenue and our expenditure, which may have previously been dealt with by our investment funds, but because there's no investment funds, we now have a gap, of course, if that is allowed to happen, and I'm believing that we wouldn't reach to that situation. But it would create a gap between our revenue and our expenditure that would need to be filled. Of course, the main reason for what we are experiencing, the main cause and the root of the challenge that we are facing at the NIBTT is the aging population. And of course, that is characterized clearly by persons, of course, having less children. And sometimes to highlight this, all we have to do is to look at the SEA exams, and this is public. At one point in time, I think in 1999, we had 30,000 children doing SEA, and now we struggle to get about 18 or 19 children to do the secondary entrance exam. And so there is a reduction in the number of children, and we see that in the 15 to 59-year age group. When we look at our working population, we see that over the 50 years of the projection from 2016, that there is a almost 25% reduction in the number of people in that age group, the 15 to 59-year age group, over the 50 years of the projection. And then when we look at the 50-plus, 60-plus age group, in our population statistics, we see that over the 50 years, that the number of people in that age group is projected to almost double over the course of that period. So we could see just from the population statistics alone, the tremendous amount of pressure that is being placed on the system and what is causing that challenge that we are facing at the NIBTT with a shrinking contributory base and, of course, a growing beneficiary base. And, of course, I'd like to point out that this is, of course, not unique to Trinidad and Tobago. And so that pressure is really causing the cost of the system to continue to rise. And so that's something that we really have to address. And our 10th actuarial review did give us some recommendations, some of which you would have heard in the public domain. For those of you from Trinidad, you would have heard one or two of them in the public domain. Of course, the first one is that the contribution rate increases should take place in the short term. One of the other recommendations, and there are 7, is that we establish what is called a funding policy. And a funding policy is something that is gaining a lot of traction now in Social Security, and is really where we seek to establish some funding objective. And this objective might be that we maintain a certain level of reserve to expenditure ratio. For example, to maintain it at the level of a 3 or 4. And once we set that objective, in the course of doing our actuarial review, if that objective is not being met, then some automatic mechanisms can come into play to bring the system back into balance. And so another recommendation is to bring more equity in the system by reducing the pension for those taking their retirement before age 65. And that has been in the public domain as well. As well as number 4, which has not really been in the public domain, but is of course public in the actuarial review, is that the parameters of the system should be automatically adjusted and that the minimum pension should be frozen to be at most 80% of the minimum wage. The 5th recommendation is better integration of the pension system between the SEP and the NIS. And I'd like to also point out that some of these recommendations are not necessarily given to impact sustainability directly. So I could tell you with this particular recommendation, although it might seem intuitive that this might help with the sustainability challenge that we are facing, it really does not have that impact on the sustainability of the system. But this recommendation comes from a place of wanting to extend coverage to to vulnerable persons in our country. I should say this one, I went a little ahead of me, number 6, which is the integration, which is the extending of coverage to self-employed persons. That's the one that we are looking to, that may not have an impact on the sustainability, but of course what it does is extend coverage to self-employed persons. Number 7, and the last recommendation, is the elimination of dual coverage and accidents coverage for accidents and health sicknesses arising out of the course of employment. And in Trinidad and Tobago, we have coverage for persons under the workman compensation, and we also have coverage for persons under the employment injury benefit branch at the NIBTT. And so the ILO in their recommendations saw that what is considered overinsurance, and the recommendation came that that be eliminated to bring the system to be a little more efficient. And so these are the recommendations, and this is the high-level overview that I wanted to give to you today. And I will turn over to our moderator, who will guide the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Andy. All right, so Andy gave us more or less the Trinidad and Tobago perspective, what's going on with the national insurance. So now I'm going to invite Derek to the podium to give us the regional perspective. Derek?
Thank you, Joel, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be with you again in a different country this time, talking about almost the same thing. And, you know, the stories have the same basis. Some governments do things differently. Some take longer than others. And I think, as Andy said today, you know, we're seeing one that's taking longer than most. So I want to start off with a little description as to why, in the first place, Social Security or social protection was put in place. The ILO came to the Caribbean back in the early 60s, and they recommended that governments put in place what we call NIB today and social welfare programs and so on. And the real purpose is to provide that comprehensive system of social protection in front of you that really should reflect each country's value system, right? Not what they do in Germany, not what they do in Italy or US or Canada, but it really should reflect our value system. It should respond to changing times, whether they be social changes, demographic changes, labor market changes, right? Be dynamic enough to make sure that we update and stay relevant. And at the end of the day, make sure we meet customer needs. And at the right-hand side, you see a little picture. So to achieve those things over the long term requires some balancing, because people want adequate benefits if they're a pensioner. If they're a contributor or an employer, they want affordable contributions. And those of us who are younger want, when our turn comes, to be able to get a pension like our parents and grandparents did, right? So if you want a bigger benefit but don't want to pay for it, you have a problem. If you don't want to pay for it, you can't get a bigger benefit, right? So we have that dynamic that's really working and competing. And as Andy talked about NIBTT and the challenges that they're facing here locally, I've tried to put into 3 different categories the challenges that have been faced today in Trinidad and Tobago. And the first one is design. There's some significant design issues, right? As he said, the non-contributory pension for senior citizens is $3,500 a month. The minimum pension for those who work 30 and 40 years is $3,000 a month. Right? And the minimum wage in Trinidad and Tobago is going up in January to about $35.50 per month. So the person who contributed is going to more like get less than the minimum wage, and the person who didn't contribute gets just about the minimum wage. So you have that anomaly in design. You also have a situation where the current contribution rate of 13.2% is less than the cost of benefits. So on average, each person putting in is not putting enough to pay for themselves, but the way the scheme is designed, they're also paying for those who came before. And as we saw, the fund will be depleted in the mid-2030s if nothing is done. We also have where, because the minimum pension has risen so fast over time, 85% of all people today who've paid contributions for at least 15 years, qualified for retirement benefit, are getting the same $3,000 a month. So NIB has worked, they've kept your contributions, they've stored them, they work your pension when you come to retire. But most folks are getting bumped up to the same $3,000 a month. And finally, as Andy mentioned, the informal sector is not covered. So a large component of the workforce in Trinidad and Tobago don't pay NIB and therefore don't qualify for a pension. The next challenge is the outlook. And as we saw, and Andy gave some figures there, the population is aging. We know we're having fewer children, smaller families. And in a few years' time, the population will start decreasing. That means every year we're going to have more deaths than we have births. There's probably still outward migration. And so you're going to have a shrinking labor force with a growing pension population. And then the outlook for the economy, the estimates you see from the IMF and local estimates are that growth will be small, maybe 1.5%, 2% for the next few years. So those new jobs that we need to create extra contributions and extra income for the fund just don't seem to be there. On the governance side, there's some other challenges. That even though the law says that the retirement age is 65, but if you stop working, you can claim at 60, almost everybody who gets the pension today starts at 60, with no reduction, as Andy just said. And then we also have a situation where the governments have been told, several times now in actuarial reviews that you need to reform, need to raise the rate, need to revise the way you design benefits, but yet kicking the can down the road is the order of the day. So I want to show you a little picture here with a few of the funds in the Caribbean, some of you in the room for different countries, and these are chosen deliberately. And the idea here is to show you the money coming in, contribution rate on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the cost of expenditure over wages, which is the y-axis, right? So let's take the red, that's TNT. You're collecting 13.2% of wages, but right now spending about 17%. And Andy showed you a while ago, for the first time in fiscal year 2022, there was more going out than coming in total. We look at Barbados, which is the bright blue on the top right. They are collecting about 18% in contributions, but spending almost 25%. They are severely challenged, and as we heard, or probably followed the news that we heard last year, their retirement age may be going from 67 to 68, right? And they're making other changes to make the fund less costly over the long term. But I deliberately showed you St. Lucia. St. Lucia is the one in the gold color. St. Lucia, when they got the actuarial review back in 2004, jumped right away on making changes to their retirement age and other formula changes. And the size of the bubble you see in front of you indicates how big the reserve is relative to the expenditure. St. Lucia has the biggest reserve today at over 15 times expenditure. They're still only paying 10% contribution rate, but look at where their cost is. And I should have said also, the pink line indicates if you're below the line, you're collecting more than expenditure. If you're above the line, you're spending more than what you're taking in, as most of you see here. I've also showed you Grenada. Grenada is about to make some radical changes come January 1st next year. They're going to increase their age from 60 to 65 in 5 years. So if you turn 60 on December 31st this year, you can qualify for a full pension. If you turn 60 on January 1 next year, you have to wait 5 years for a full pension. There'll be reduction factors before that, but they have gone really drastic because they haven't changed in over 40 years. Right? And their bubble, as we see here, is smaller than, it's bigger than Trinidad, but smaller than St. Lucia, and they feel the urge to make radical changes. Bahamas, another one on the map, the light blue, again, hasn't made reforms, still a very low contribution rate, and they have announced changes to come in July. And the final one is Guyana. And 3 years ago, we were fearful that Guyana would go broke in 2 years' time, 2025. But as they say, Guyana found oil, and things are going to change in their economy. So even though they're already spending more than they're taking in, and they have a very, very small reserve, they should be looking good. But for Trinidad, just for a little comparison, 20 years ago, the contribution rate was 8%, 8.4%. Expenditure was 4.5%. So over 20 years, expenditure has more than quadrupled, as Andy mentioned as well in his talk. And the only way you can make these funds more sustainable is you either have to increase income or decrease expenditure. And the very few options, contribution rate is is the biggest one on the income side. You can better invest your fund, be more aggressive. But if you think about Trinidad and Tobago now, they're drawing down on their assets. You can't be aggressive when you're investing if you have to go and dig into your savings every single year. You've got to be more cautious, have some liquid assets, and be careful with volatility. Compliance also is a challenge here, and that could be improved as well. But the more you collect from contributors, they're going to benefit for pension in the future. On the cost side, we look at change in the formula. We look at change in the age, so fewer people qualify. We look at making the pension amount a little smaller. And finally, increases in pensions. In Trinidad, the habit is that governments will announce either on a budget time or before elections to increase the pensions to another dollar amount. And hopefully we can find a way to control that to ensure that costs do not escalate beyond affordability. And so what we believe is that there are only 4 ingredients. Probably 4 is a big number, but for these 4 things are critical to ensuring long-term sustainability. The first is the economy, right? If you think about NIB, it depends on workers, and having higher wages. So the more people working, the higher the wage, the better income will be, and the more able it is to make the benefit payments on time. Secondly, good design. I mentioned earlier some challenges on the design side. So design is important. It has to make sense for today, for the labor market today. It has to make sense for sustainability if we're going to promise our children and grandchildren a pension when it's their turn to get. Third, admin systems that are efficient. Everybody needs to pay contributions on time. It needs to be at the right amount, okay? And then paying them a pension when it's their turn to get. And finally, and probably most importantly, is governance. I like to say honest and responsible governance, right? It's not honest if you can't bring your report that the actuaries gave you to share with the public. It's not responsible if you keep kicking the can down the road, right? The best way to get change and the best way to achieve success in these systems is to have honest and dialogue with the population. Let the unions know. Oh, I'll tell you a story too. In Grenada, the unions wrote the government 3-4 years ago pushing for the age to go up. Here in TNT, we have the unions challenging the age from being increased. And so governments have a tough call. But we have to be responsible if we want to have these systems be around in the future for children and grandchildren. This is my final slide, and hopefully those of you in the room who are Trinidadian can recognize the vehicle and the number on the vehicle, right? When last you see a PAJ, right? That's a 1971 model. Anyone want, guess what vehicle that is? Datsun? You're right so far. One more. Datsun what? 120Y. Wow, excellent. Some of you all in the room, a good age, right? So in 1971, the NIBT Act came into being. That car was also in Trinidad on the road in 1971. I don't think many around today, right? So it's really time for a change in model of the NIBTT. And given that almost everybody already gets the same amount, why not give everybody the same amount just because they're old, right? Find a way to make NIB only really necessary for those people who earn a significant amount, right? All the informers, like the people who earn less, all the people who have lower incomes in the formal sector will automatically get a state-funded flat benefit, right? Less work for NIB to do, and a top-up for those in the room who are well paid in Trinidad and Tobago. But the last 2 points also are very important. One is that the pensions should not be adjusted by the government of the day when they figure they want more votes. It should be done because inflation has said that the cost of flour, the cost of bread, the cost of saltfish has gone up, right? And secondly, the final point here is that the actuary comes every 5 years, makes recommendations, the report eventually goes to Parliament, and governments don't have to act. They can just do nothing until the next 5 years it comes again, and hopefully somebody else makes a tough decision. What we need to have in our acts are triggers that are going to tell government that if the path has been set, so you have some goals that are established as to where you want to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now. The actuary comes and you're sliding off that path, the trigger should be there to say, we're going to do A, B, and C to get us back on that path. And that will bring some security to younger people that NIB will be there for them when it's their turn to get. So just to wrap up again, and this is about back to the value system, and back to TNT, and back to that balancing act we have to find. Does your value system reflect what you do, or does what you do reflect your value system? So in TNT today, we have that anomaly where you get more for not contributing, and you get less when you contribute. It's value system. That's what we do, right? But I think it's really time that we find a way to find that sweet spot between benefit adequacy for those who we think are poor and need that support, how much you charge in contributions for those who are going to pay for it, to ensure that the system will be sustainable for many, many years to come. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Derek. All right, so two things stood out for me while listening to Derek. One, I never saw a 120i with those kind of rims before. So I don't know where Derek got that photo. And secondly, I just also want to wish our friends from Barbados, happy Independence Day. A good moment to celebrate. All right. So we just had the regional perspective, So we started off with the TT perspective, regional perspective. Now we're going to get somebody to bring it all together and create a little bacchanal in the middle of it too. So I'm going to invite Mr. Mariano Brown.
Can I borrow your last two slides?
Sure. You can ask the moderator.
Could I borrow his last two slides, please? The one with the matrix on good governance and a couple other things, yes? Please and thank you. First, I'd like to congratulate you all for coming together and having a conference of this nature. I'm not certain I should say thank you very much, or you should say thanks for me coming, because you're not listening to what I'm going to say. Yes, if you can give me the slide before this one.
Before, after.
Good. But it's important, I think, that we compare notes across the region. There are many similarities. We are different, but there are many similarities in a number of the challenges that we face. As a small developing region, small island states, we're all facing climate change. So there are a number of critical issues, and we're looking at the issue of the longevity and the sustainability of the system, which is important. One of the important things that was said by the previous presenter was the question of value system. That was important. Precisely because that's one of the difficulties, or one of the reasons why we have difficulty with our social security systems. Most of our political systems are, in a sense, started by labor movements, which, by definition, therefore, have always tended to look at the cause of the small man. And given our history, we've always had if you want, an anti-establishment bias. So that has always created some degree of issues in terms of how we do it, what we do. But the bottom line is in terms of when we have to take responsibility for ourselves, when we take responsibility for our country, then there are a number of issues that have to fall into place and fall into play. When we talk about good governance, good economy, that's important. Too often, we found at a political level that it's easy to throw the blame on the private sector and the private sector's inefficiencies or inabilities to grow. Whereas the reality is that it always takes two hands to clap. The private sector cannot grow adequately if, by definition, our systems and the design of the economy isn't working well. And that has to do with the ease of doing business. That's a fundamental issue moving forward. And how does that all come back to the issue of good governance and social security systems? Well, fundamental issue is that we can't depend purely on government. Government income comes from taxation. Taxation comes from profits. Taxation comes from economic activity. So the fundamental issue is that we have to build a strong and prosperous economy. That's the first instance. And then we have to talk about the elements of distribution. And the social security systems, by definition, have an element of distributional capacity in it. So that means that we have to engage the public in a change management system. Because what has happened is that since independence, we have now come the full route. We now find ourselves with very many of the same problems that developed societies have. Non-communicable diseases is one. The fact that our populations are aging is the other one. Why? Because richer populations, by definition, tend to have less children. As the economy develops, it becomes a little bit more expensive to manage things. So that the question of balance and design now takes on a very, or much more important perspective perhaps than we've tended to pay it in the past. And also the role of government becomes more important. All of these decisions, and we know that time and money are closely related. The more you save and the earlier you start to save, the more money you have at the end. So the reality is that if we have to make any adjustments to the systems, it is better done sooner rather than later. So the contrast between Grenada, where Grenada's labor movement is in fact pushing and ensuring that the government stands up to the plate and make the necessary adjustments, is completely averse to our situation in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, where the reverse is true. You'll find that labor leaders will say in private what they will not say in public. And the reality is because we have not educated our country, we've not educated our citizenry on what are the key elements of financial stability, financial security. And it's not about what somebody else will do, it's about how we are responsible for ourselves. That is particularly so in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, where everybody feels that government is responsible. Government has to do something. Well, government can't do anything more than what the economic system allows. And we all know that energy sector and oil and gas are wasting resources. We face it now. We've been having a declining curve in terms of our supply functions and our ability to produce at the level at which we did before. Our situation is different to Guyana. So that means, what do we need at this stage of the game? Well, affordability and the issue of balance, and the issue of looking at the alternatives in terms of what are the economic formulations that we need to prosper and to grow. And we've gone back to some basics, but not fast enough. And this situation is not new. It's not that we're not aware of it, but the issue is that we've always avoided it for making those difficult decisions cost votes. And that's the fundamental difficulty that we have to put on the table. Honest and responsible. Those are critical issues. So the reports come to Parliament, but generally speaking, they are neither debated, nor are they the Minister in the Ministry of Finance, and that's my old position. I was responsible for NIB. My job was to lay the report in Parliament, not to discuss it, not to bring it to anybody's attention, not to talk about what the recommendations mean or the changes that we need to make as a matter of policy. But I always remember, I always came away with the one signal point, that if the one thing that we could do is to ensure that the NIB stays independent. And I know Andy can't say some of the things that probably he would want to say, but he's an employee. I no longer have that difficulty, so I can say what I want. And I think that's one of the reasons why they put me on this panel anyhow. Right. So the issue isn't that the system isn't efficient. Well, you always have to make adjustments to make things more efficient. That's a fundamental. But the issue of design, economic performance, and by definition, the sense of responsibility. Is it responsible for a government to postpone making those decisions? Is it responsible to move away or not to accept the fact that we have to do certain things to make the system stronger? And that means adjusting the retirement age. That's a fact. That's not something that we could get away from literally almost anywhere in the world. In fact, Trinidad and Tobago has the lowest age for retirement as we speak, if I'm not mistaken. Well, I'm not mistaken. We have the lowest age. It is 60. I think the next nearest is 62. And Barbados has had to face that difficulty. I worked in Barbados for 14 years. And it's interesting that they understand as a country, as well as a triumvirate, that is private sector, public sector, and the labor movement, they understand that you had to deal with the issues of sustainability. So they addressed it very early. Unfortunately, smaller the population, the bigger the impact of aging. So they've had to make some adjustments, and now they are moving from 67 to 68. It is causing a negative feedback. But what you will find, and one of the key differences between Barbados and Trinidad in that regard, is that people will complain. Once the decision is made, everybody gets focused on the goal. Mm-hmm. And that's the difference, and that's what the importance of responsibility is. And leadership, I think that's the most important point, leadership. Right? Leadership is to help people move away, to look from the obstacles, to look at what do we want to achieve. And that's one of the fundamental things that has been holding us back. And holding us back also, in terms of the way the legislation is structured, that most of the decisions that affect the NIB ultimately require approval. Approval from whom? The Minister of Finance has literally a jockey position. So, and when we talk about sustainability and in terms of the wider context, because this not only affects Trinidad and Tobago, this affects the region. And we have been talking about national security systems, national social security systems across the board. Now let's ask the fundamental questions. How are the pension systems in government operate? They are unfunded liabilities that are claims upon the state. And they're unfunded. When I was in government, the unfunded liability, I think, was estimated at about $35 billion. That was in 2008, 2009. Right? Well, you are the guys who are little whizzes with arithmetic, so I don't have to tell you too much about it. By now, of course, that liability is about $100 billion. What's the size of the NIB fund? 29. 29. So even if you take the NIB fund into consideration as a social security fund, from a country perspective, the unknown and bigger liability are the liabilities of public servants, which are claims against the state and therefore claims against our taxation revenue moving forward. So even as we speak about reforming the NIB and social security systems across the region, what we also have to talk about reforming the pension systems as a whole and reforming the pension systems as they deal with government. So we've come back to a fundamental issue about integration, about balance between private sector pensions, public sector pensions, social security systems, and making people individually responsible for their future. I think those are some of the key things that have moved. And we have to understand that the value systems at the outset, where perhaps we may have been railing against a colonial system of government, no longer exist. We are responsible for ourselves. And therefore, leadership, good governance, design, and a good economy. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
All right, thank you very much, Mariano. All right, so as I said, I'm going to try and make this as interactive as possible. And I believe in discussion. I think discussion is what allows us to really get to the meat of things. So one of the things that both Andy and Derek would have mentioned is the actuarial review. The last one I think you all said was done in June 2016. The first question off the top, when is the next, when can we expect the results of the next one? And was that impacted by the pandemic in terms of the actuarial review that was done in the NIS? Andy, I don't know if you can take that.
Yes, well, of course, I think Mariano did touch on it. It's subject to a parliamentary process.
Right.
And so once that process is complete, then the report becomes public.
But do we have any idea when the possibility that it might be made public?
Well, I wouldn't be able to say exactly when. Of course, I said it is subject to the process.
Yeah.
You know,
I'll say
that is out of the NIBTT's control.
The minister determines when it's going to be made public.
Yeah.
Right? In the case of Trinidad, we go to the Minister of Finance. And if we have to go on the basis of a history, by definition, the actuarial reports are late anyhow.
Right.
You could just add another year on top of that.
But I'll also say that the cycle here is 5 years.
Right.
Most other countries, it's 3 years. And given where the fund is today, they should go to
periods.
3 years.
Should aim for
No more than
that
3 years because of the nature of how close you are and what we saw. The 16 projections showed the first year of going negative, having a deficit 2 years later than what had actually happened.
Yeah.
So it's really need for a review sooner.
And we have been, it's really, all the legislation says within every 5 years. We have been doing it every 3 years.
But you have been.
Right? Yes, basically we have been doing it every 3.
So the last one was 19?
The last one actually would have been 20,
20,
right?
20.
We made a little adjustment, but
4 years.
generally
Okay.
within every 3 years,
Okay.
or earlier than 5 years.
Okay.
All right, so one of the conversations that we have had, especially coming out of the last budget presentation, is the amendment to the retirement age. Are you satisfied that the population, and this is for you, Mr. Rowe, are you satisfied that the population really understands that conversation? Or is it one of those things where we just, the conversation starts, we get riled up, but we don't really understand what the issue is? Do you think that we really understand what the situation is in terms of the retirement age?
So as the outsider here, and what I've read and heard is that the law says 65.
Right.
The law also says that if you stop working and you're 60 or over, you can qualify.
Right.
I think what's happening here is that you get the boss man to let us to say that, okay, Derek Osborne has retired today,
Yeah.
and they give me the pension, but tomorrow I'm back to work, so I'm still working and getting the pension.
Right.
And I think that's the issue. So, in Barbados and in the Bahamas, there are retirement benefits too. If you stop working, you qualify. If you keep working, you don't qualify.
Okay.
And so it has to be more stringent application of the law. And they talk about a reduced pension at age 60. I am not sure if I could see the government keeping the $3,000 pension, but reducing by 25 or 30% if you go at 60, right? And so retirement age message needs to be clearer.
Right.
What you really, really mean by older age. It's already 65. Implement the law.
I think the first point that needs to be made where that is concerned is that the point that you made about regularity, review of the system, quicker, but that also has to do with decision making. The decision making has to be a lot faster. In the case of, and also the mechanisms that we use for that. So for example, you asked the question of whether people are aware. The answer is that people are not aware.
Right.
All right? In a general sense, they know that they've been talking about it. They have no idea what the law really says, or what the practice is, or why is there divergence between them. That has never really been addressed in terms of a conversation. The conversations are not public in the sense, when I say not public, they're not a national debate. So it's not at the front end of anybody's consciousness. Most people have in mind that 60 is a magical age and they retire. All right? The reality is, of course, most people can work way past 60, and we haven't started to incorporate that in our language or in the possibilities that are available to us. So that really is a conversation. Now, I'm going to go back to the issue of responsible governments where that is concerned. All right? The national conversation is managed by agenda. It's who has control of the front page? Literally, if you're on a platform. So who's on a platform more often than others? You're on a platform in Parliament, you're on a platform in terms of public meetings. So it's really a political debate, because those decisions, those social issues, are issues which are widespread. So they really require, and that's one of the reasons why I emphasize the issue of leadership. In the same way that in an organization, the success of the organization is largely associated also with the quality of its leadership. The same thing with regard to the issues that we address. And quite frankly, we've not addressed the issue, and we've not put it in the public domain in the fashion in which it ought to have been put. And the issue is not merely the sustainability of the public pension system, which is national insurance. I raised the issue of the wider issue of the sustainability of government pensions, which are totally unfunded, and there are liabilities across the system. It's not only true of Trinidad and Tobago. Many national governments face this problem elsewhere. They have bigger economies. That's the difference.
And Joel, if I may just add, sometimes we look at the whole issue of retirement age, and we don't, because the underlying thing is the aging population that is putting some pressure on the system, and there are implications to that aging population beyond just the NIB and its sustainability. And I think the implications span, as you would have touched, Mariano, fiscally, because the 15 to 59-year age group that I was able to highlight in the table is not only the NIB's contributory base, but is the tax base.
Right. And
And then we have the SEP, which is unfunded, that of course is just as the NIBTT's beneficiaries are accelerating, so will the beneficiaries of the SEP. So we have a fiscal implication. You also have an economic implication of the aging population in terms of, when we talk about economic growth, we talk about increasing the number of persons, the increase in productivity, or increase in the utilization of time will impact the growth of the economy. And if the population is decreasing, then it means that there's also an economic impact. So if we look at even the challenge greater than just the NIBTT, we would see that talking about a retirement age is not really that unreasonable when you look at all the implications that is being faced, because of the aging population that we're experiencing.
Well, one of the other things that follows from that is in terms of population statistics, and I've done some work on it during the course of this year, because economic growth, when you look at the dynamics of economic growth is a factor both of productivity, innovation, as well as an increasing population. Right? It's arithmetic. That's one of the reasons why both India and China have shown such fairly dramatic rates of growth. The change the basis in the system, but improve productivity down at the bottom. And because of the large numbers, they have moved upwards in terms of ranking, so that India and China, in the space of the last 30 years, have moved from literally being nowhere on a scale to numbers 2 and number 5 in terms of the size of the economy. The larger countries that are there, the number 3 country is Japan, aging population, and as we know that Japan's economic size peaked somewhere around 1990, but they have never been able to achieve the same levels of growth as other countries have. So that when we look at the fundamental issue that is driving all of this, of course, is population size. And if we have aging populations and therefore also declining populations moving forward, how do you address that variable? Well, the 3 economies that have shown continuous growth over time, and in fact, relative to the land mass, they have smaller populations and probably could be supported, is New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. And the one dynamo that is the largest population, well, not the largest population size in the world, actually it accounts for 5% of the world's population is the United States. Right, but it accounts for, is the number 1 in the economy. But all 4 of those countries have something similar. Right? They're all built on immigration. A fundamental issue. Now that's not part of the conversation at all. We're still talking about just talking about balancing the social security systems. Right? Whereas the fundamental issue in terms of countries which are larger than us, which have had to face and to how do they solve the issue of growth, right? Immigration is one of those issues. That's not part of this conversation at all, but it is something that we have to deal with and we have to put on the table.
Marion, I have a question. So you are the Chief Executive Officer of the leading
business school.
Postgraduate business school, right? Is there any concern if the retirement age is increased? Is there any concern about how it may impact or affect like youth unemployment?
How it will impact, sorry?
Like youth unemployment.
Youth unemployment.
Youth unemployment.
Yeah.
Well, let's put it this way. The biggest difficulties that we have, everybody likes to think of 1970 and we give it a social name, Black Power movement. The real issue with unemployment was the growth in unemployment in a particular segment of our population, the younger segment of the population.
I think the audio is dipping. I don't know if the battery.
Try again.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not, hello, yes.
Yeah,
You go ahead.
Right, but it's coming and going.
Yeah.
But let's put it this way. You always have, that's one of the reasons why I talked about, I focus on the economy and economic growth and a different formulation for economic growth. What Trinidad has, which is different to the rest of the region, is that our labor participation rate has been declining.
Right.
And declining at a faster rate than any decline in the population. So there's something else taking place, and that we have to address the issue of values, and whether that younger grouping is working in the same, wants to work in the same fashion perhaps as generations that went by. So that's an issue that we have to face as well. So that I don't think that we probably will have to, we have to address the issue of youth unemployment, but we also have to address the bigger picture of economic growth in the longer run in terms of what we're doing and how we structure the economy. Now, those are the important types of conversations that have to be had. There are a number of what you call key priorities, but they're not necessarily on the conversation table or on the objective list of numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 in a way that the country hangs on to and says, these are the things we have to focus on.
All right. So I asked the team to just pull up Andy's presentation with the recommendations, right? I don't know if you could put the recommendations on the screen.
There they are.
Right. So these I think was it 7 recommendations, Andy? All right. Derek, watching the recommendations, if you were placed in a position of making a decision in terms of balancing the equation as we go with our theme. What would you say is the recommendation that we should focus on at this point? So far, I don't have the recommendations on the screen. So recommendation 1 is contribution rate increases should be scheduled in a short term.
Right.
2 is the establishment of a funding policy. 3 is bringing more equity in the system by reducing the pension for those taking their retirement before age 65. Because
No, certainly, well, let's go these 3. These are on the income side.
Yeah.
Now, my job is easy. Yeah? I give advice, right? Mariano's former job, tough one.
Implementation.
Around that table,
Yeah.
when you have 15 people looking for what they want,
Yeah,
and they want it
slice
now,
of the pie.
it's
Yeah.
a different story, right? So go back, please, to the previous slide. So definitely, so we saw earlier on my slide, I think it's about 17-point-something% been paid out today. So you definitely got to raise the rate to at least 16-17%, at least. Funding policy. The funding policy should definitely say our target will be a reserve ratio of, say, no less than 2 or 3 times 10 or 15 years from the actuarial review date.
Right.
But the actuary comes in, he or she runs the numbers, and the reserve is falling. If it falls below, say, 3 in 10 years' time, you have to do something. Cut benefits or increase the contribution rate. So that should be in written, it should be in the act. And once the report is tabled, then the population knows, and the NIB may have, say, 2 months to put together some recommendations. Parliament has 2 months to act. Something has to be done, right? It applies in Canada, and it's seen elsewhere in the world. Number 3 is equity in the system. So I certainly agree that if the age is 65, somebody who goes at 60 should get less.
Right.
They'll receive pension for longer. How it's done in Trinidad and Tobago is going to be complicated because 60 has been the age, and 3,000 is the pension. So no ideas to the government, but unless they give another increase and don't apply it to people who are 60, then it's probably easy to do that way. I'm really not going to see a reduction to 2,500 for people who go in next year at age 60. I just don't see it happening. Right. The next few slides. Next slide. Parameters for the scheme should be automatically adjusted again. I mentioned that too. You know, every 2 years, every 3 years. So in Barbados, Bahamas, and BVI, the law says every year, whatever inflation is, there'll be adjustments to the wage ceiling and to pensions. Right. It's in the law. No minister of government going to promise you a big pension increase if you vote for me. That doesn't happen. Better integration of the system with the old age pensions. Yes, for sure. They should be harmonized. There should be a way that they work well together. As I mentioned, find a way to maybe make NIB only relevant to higher income people. Let everybody else who's old, who's been here 15, 20 years, get a state-financed pension. Number 6, self-employed. So with my recommendation, it's probably too late to do that. Now, this has been on the table for 20 years. They've studied covering them for at least 15, 20 years. Never pulled the trigger, hasn't happened. Probably too late now. So find a way to have them pay adequate taxes through a VAT or some other way to help finance their benefit when they get old. And so you have a state-financed pension for everybody. Number 7, dual coverage. I believe you have a mandatory workers' compensation. Is that the issue? Right. So you have a dual. So employers are probably paying double, essentially, for a very low-cost benefit.
Right.
Not a big deal. That one doesn't move the needle anywhere. And that's it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's room to maneuver,
yeah,
but it has to involve contribution rate increase and benefit changes.
Okay.
Yeah. Age change as well.
Mariana, I see you smiling.
Well, smiling, yes.
any
because he's right. There's no way they're going to be able to reduce benefits in terms of reducing the pension. But in a sense, they've done that. They've allowed inflation to do that because we've kept it capped at 3,000
for a while.
For a while,
yeah.
right? So for 10 years. So, I mean, that has taken place, and that we probably have to do it for a little longer, but that is still not going to be sufficient to close the gap, to close the gap. So I think what we have to increase the contribution rate, we have to change the retirement age. So that's a change management process. And I think that it has to be done in stages because doing it once is not going to be sufficient. If we think that because we make an adjustment to retirement age or we increase the contribution, that will solve the problem. It won't, it can't. Right? By definition, you're going to have to revisit the proposition. So some of what Derek is saying with regard to some triggers, putting in some mechanisms, and it has to be linked to your fiscal system. Right? And the way we're doing it is not. We're treating it as though it's somehow the other is separate and not integrated. We have to take that into consideration as well. Because ultimately, who does it fall to rectify any deficits in the system? It is going to fall to the central government. So you might as well take the position up front, right, and make some of those decisions. You have the change management system and the conversation in terms of how it has to be, and the communication in terms of how it has to be balanced, has to be a national conversation and has to be done over a particular period of time. But you have to set a limit. Otherwise, we'll end up like property tax. Nobody's going to make any decision. So bottom line, those two things have to happen. But the broader changes also need to be reflected in the law. Now, that always takes time, of course, but fundamental to all of this is the issue of responsible government. And governments have to take the position, political parties have to take the position, this is going to bite you anyhow. Right? So if you don't take the position today and you don't deal with it today, it's going to hurt you more down the road. So you might as well take it today. And I think the private sector has to take a lead in getting both sides to the table, both labor and government, to recognize it as something that has to be dealt with. You can't just keep pushing it down.
All right. So, Andy, I just want to bring you back in the conversation here. How well does the NIB verify, like people who claim at 60 that they are still not actively employed? What are these stopgap measures or the measures that are put in place to ensure that there's no such a leakage in that regard?
Well, I will tell you that there are ways that we can do.
Okay.
Some of which I wouldn't want to reveal. But generally, the NIB also does audits. Okay. You know, so that's one of the ways when we go out to employers, may be able to uncover instances where persons may have not ceased employment before coming to apply to the NIB for benefits. Okay. All right. Strictly, I don't think this you may not recognize, but our act does allow for if persons go back out to work. You know, so if you go back out to work, we don't stop you.
Right.
All right.
But you don't stop them.
We don't stop you. All right.
No, you can't by law, or you just choose not to.
No, the law says we don't stop you.
So once they start, right, they can keep going.
They keep going, right?
That's that needs to be changed.
But but in order to qualify for the benefit, you must cease it. You must stop. You know, and so that's also on our application form. You must cease. The employer must
stop for a while.
But you must cease employment.
Yes.
All right. You must cease employment in order to access the retirement benefit.
Right. Okay. So Joel, just as the person put new rims on the 71, you need to change the rules on working and pension on the 71 model NIB.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so at this juncture, it has been an engaging conversation. I just want to also invite you all to be part of the conversation. So if you have any questions, if you have any statements, if you have any concerns, you can just raise your hand. I believe the team will just bring the mic to you. So you can be part of the conversation. There may be something that you heard one of the panelists say that you'd like some clarification on. I just want to open the floor to you at this point in time. Don't be shy, it's Trinidad.
There's one in the front here, James.
Yeah.
Hello?
Afternoon.
Afternoon, everyone. I know in the recent budget speech, the finance minister would have mentioned increasing the retirement age to 65 for everyone, basically. So obviously, there are 7 recommendations, but that's the one that he's thinking of. That's my interpretation. Has there been any talk about any interim measures or transition measures, how to achieve that? Is there going to be, like other countries may have 60 tomorrow, 61 in 2 years' time, 62 in 3 years' time, that kind of thing? Or a reduction factor, say 6%, as in other territories? Is there any talk about how they're going to implement that measure? But it's going to be just cut off and that does it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, James, I could tell you about the recommendation. The recommendation of the ILO, right, is really that it be phased in over a 10-year period. So it's not something that will happen based on the strict recommendation. Of course, those are recommendations. We have been in discussion, right, with our stakeholders regarding that. So I can't say that the final product will be exactly what is recommended, but the recommendation, the strict recommendation, is that it be phased in over a 10-year period. So an example of that might be that, if we start in 2025, for example, then in 2027, the retirement age for a full pension will go from 60 to 61, all right, and then increase gradually until we reach 65. And so that's the pure recommendation of the actuarial review, that it be phased in. Yes, and of course, yes, and that is the recommendation. We have the option, based on the pure recommendation, to retire earlier than 60. So that's in the first example where I gave, where we gradually increasing, and in 4 years we get to 62, for example. Then the full pension will be available at 62. But if you want to retire at 61 or 60, you can do so, all right? But with the application of the reduction factors. And so that's the pure recommendation from the actuarial review.
The only difficulty with that is he said the same thing in the last year's budget speech too. And for the 5 years before that, he said it wasn't a problem. So I think he's gradually coming to the recognition that it is, but I'm not so certain that because he said it, it means that it's going to speed up any faster. And I think that's where the issue of leadership that has to come in terms of activating the private sector to put some pressure where those things are concerned.
Hi, Mariano. How are you doing?
Hi, good, sir.
As you have said just now, and we are all, let's say, of generations that have seen Trinidad go through several financial incidents. The NIB is an insurance company.
Yes.
Look at it. And we are, Trinidad has a history of every 20 years or so erupt in a financial crisis because of lack of action. From where I sit, I see this as a systemic problem, a systemic risk. But neither has the IMF or other rating agencies. And I have been, as you know, held public office from time to time. You mentioned this as it's an off-balance sheet sort of contingent liability. We really don't measure off-balance sheet liabilities until they come home to roost. And as a representative of the NIB has said, that they are now in a phase of disposing of assets in order to meet liabilities, correct?
Yes, the big first year.
Correct. But as the mathematicians in the room would say, the vector then, or the speed at which this is going to happen is, without leadership and action, is going to hasten that. The speed is going to accelerate, right? And because the system, the asset security system then, is so connected that if you start to dispose of, and because you are heavily concentrated and you are owners of very significant positions in the equity markets, right? If you start to dispose of equities, as you know, our markets are thin, Mariano. Prices drop. Loans that are secured by equity start to be called in, and it's a cascading effect. And I think the private sector and the banking community should really weigh these risks, these outsized risks, as a potential event and measure them and be outspoken, as you say, come to the table and say, listen, this is something we can't allow to gather some steam then, because as you know, Trinidad is, it has a history of ignoring things that are out there,
It's too late.
then all of a sudden, we have to seek help. But the time is that now if we take proactive action, we could maybe soften the blow that I personally see that is going to come.
I'm not certain that requires an answer. I think the answer, the point is that you're right.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I raised the issue of the unfunded liability of government's pension system on the other side of the fence. Because it really requires, you could look at it as an opportunity, it really requires comprehensive action moving forward in terms of what some other possibilities are in terms of, in fact, improving the investment climate. But it requires, that's why I said it requires leadership, right, and good governance from that perspective, and that cannot be underestimated.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Afternoon.
David Saintsay, Tata Life Insurance Limited. I had two questions. Question one, do you have a feel for if the NIB were to be able to eliminate all fraudulent claims and overpayment of benefits from late notifications of death, would that have any sort of significant impact on the amount of benefit payments that go out of the NIB every year? So that's question one. And question two, you said you needed 17%, but you're currently getting 13%. So once you continue making promises, the erosion of the NIB fund continues. Is it time to start thinking outside the box? By, for example, going to employers and saying, if your employees are promised a pension of at least $3,000 a month through this occupational pension scheme, that you could opt out of the NIB. So the employee NIB bill falls, the employee gets their $3,000 a month, and the erosion on the NIB fund falls. That's just outside of the box thinking. What's your thought on that?
I think, let me address the first one. You talk about, overpayment because of debts. Well, the NIBTT does have a MOU with the Ministry of Legal Affairs. And so we receive debt information from persons who die in Trinidad and Tobago, and they come to us on a very regular basis, maybe weekly. And so we are able to address cases where people die, because remember the NIBTT did have what we call life certificates that people used to have to come in to present. But now we don't have that anymore because of our engagement with the Ministry of Legal Affairs, and that has made that much more efficient. And of course, we can be more agile and quickly adjust when we get the information from the Ministry of Social Development. The only people that required now to do the life certificates are persons who are abroad, because they're not in our jurisdiction, so we can have some level of control. So we really have addressed that in that form. I think your second question had to do with the
Opting out?
the
Opting out.
of the opting out. The NIBTT, I know I have my view, the NIBTT is a mandatory system. And that is what helps, I think, the system overall, the pooling of all of those things. I personally don't see that maybe as a real option to opt out of the NIBTT. I don't know what Derek would also say on this matter.
Yeah. I'll chime in. Okay.
But I think it's we need to maintain the mandatory aspect of the NIBTT for it to be successful.
Yeah, opting out will go against what you really want to do, which is to make the contribution base larger. So if you think about the way the fund is financed, it's partially funded or almost pay as you go. It depends on the contributions of workers to meet the cost of benefits, right? And so the change in demographics is what's driving the increase in costs as well. And there's a quote I heard some time ago, and it's almost Christmas time, and I'll try and remember it. It said, children ask Santa for gifts that their parents have to pay for. Social Security is where the parents ask for what they want, and the children have to pay for it. You got that? So Social Security, the promise that we're making now, that the older people in Trinidad are asking for a big pension, they want this big pension, but who pays the bill? Their children and their grandchildren, right? And so if you make the generation behind smaller, of contributors smaller, it's going to make it more challenging on those few who are paying in. The same for taxes, right? And so opting out is not a suitable option for Social Security schemes. Certainly not. It makes it more compulsory, or make it sustainable by making the promise consistent with the cost, with the contribution rate. Actuarially sustainable, as we actuaries probably would say.
My name is Neil. I'm from Ghana.
Afternoon.
My question is more of curiosity. For the first speaker, with the recommendations that were given by the evaluation report, I see the self-employed, and Derek even mentioned about it. They are sort of hanging fruits that I believe it's the first thing that you have to look at. I don't know much about the bill that is going to the Parliament, but I can, from the presentations, I hear of a parametric kind of reform, but with the third speaker telling me that you need a systemic reform. And I just want to know, how large is the self-employed population? That's my major question.
Yeah. I think that the, if you're through, I think maybe if I address, even going back to what you said about self-employed, self-employed is not, I'd like to clarify, is not going to be something that will save the system. Because remember, when we showed the population statistics, that was everybody in the population. All right? So bringing them on board is not something that is going to, and that's actually highlighted in the 10th actuarial review, where we saw that bringing in self-employed will increase the assets, but we will end up at the same place. All right? In terms of it doesn't take it out any further, all right? But the issue of it is really the issue of coverage. And there is a cost to bringing self-employed people on board. I think the cost is estimated in the actuarial review to be maybe somewhere around between 200 or 300 million to bring them on board, because there are certain things that we need to do to encourage self-employed persons in the system, some of which is like offering age credits. Another proposal that has to do with co-payments for low-income SEP to get them on board so that we pay part, because remember they are self-employed and they will have to take up the full shebang of the contribution rate, where persons who are salaried have to also pay, they pay part and the employer pays part in Trinidad and Tobago. And so there's some, there's a group that is challenging to try to bring on board. I think we have, well over 100,000. I can't remember what the latest information we normally get from the CSO about how many self-employed persons that we have. I think there's well over 100,000 self-employed persons in Trinidad and Tobago. So that's an ongoing thing. I know, as Derek said, we've been, talking about it for a long while, but it doesn't involve a measure of cost and to bring them and to onboard them.
But I'll tell you, when we migrate to go live in the US and London and Canada, we know how to follow the rules where there are rules, right? Unfortunately, in the Caribbean, governments aren't willing to say that if you're a bus driver and you aren't NIS compliant, you can't drive your bus. Or you can't be a lawyer, you can't be an actuary, right? We need to find a way to have the government systems that issue licenses and permits to do your trade check with NIS in a very efficient way, and if you aren't compliant, you can't practice your trade, right? And so unless we're serious, right, and that probably won't happen anytime soon, and that's why I'm recommending that we change the whole system and say everybody who's old gets a pension, but you find a way to make sure they pay their taxes, whether it be in the grocery store or whatever they have to buy, whether you make VAT higher or make whatever it is, that they pay a fair share of taxes that would allow the government to finance these pensions for everybody.
Yeah, and even just to add to what Derek is saying as well, I think even in countries where they have SEP, self-employed, covered,
15,
and it's mandatory, the coverage is
10-15%.
is pretty low.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so they're, even in bringing them on, there's a lot of considerations and a lot of working with other stakeholders to ensure that we get them to,
Yeah.
to increase their coverage, to be included in the system.
I have a question. I was fascinated by one of Andy's slides, which showed the history of the minimum pension increasing from 1,000 to 2,000 after 4 years, and then another 50% on that to 3,000 4 years later. And we also touched on like the values of the jurisdictions. I wonder if you can give, there's a multi-part question here. I wonder if you can give some insights on the factors that led to the increase in the minimum pension at such a, seems to me, such a meteoric rise over a short space in time.
Maybe for you.
Also, how did that play into the actuarial forecasts? And thirdly, presumably it increased the purchasing power of the retiree population, and has that had any economic impact?
Well, the second and third question, I think he will answer. The first one I will answer, right? Because it's part of the political dynamic. And just to put, if you look at Trinidad and Tobago's economic history, we've had periods of boom and bust. And what you would find is that within the periods of boom, because of the fact that the expansion of the economy is really exogenous, means that it comes from increasing oil prices, comes from increasing energy prices, and so on. And government increases expenditure. It puts pressure on the system, and inflation goes out of whack. And part of the reason for that also happening between that 2003, 2014 period was the world also had a problem, which was exacerbated in Trinidad because it was beginning of the super commodity cycle in which China's participation in the world economy pushed up the rate of inflation. So that explains part of that. So you'll get a groundswell of support of conversations at every budget speech that you would expect the retirement benefit to be increased, and that's exactly what happened. It became the sort of groundswell requirement literally before an election campaign, and you found that it went up all the time. But the last increase, of course, has also been a politically driven increase at a time of, if you want, a lot of competition in the political system. So it's really politically determined and in response to the social situation and inflation. Now, you could handle 2 other questions.
Well, of course, when you increase increasing the pension amount, in our case, the minimum pension does have an impact on overall cost. So it will have an impact on our, as we project out in our actuarial valuations. However, one of the things that I point out, when we did have those increases in 2004, 2008, and 2012, there were also contribution rate increases at those times. Right? So it was not just a straight increase in the minimum pension that occurred in that time. We also had increases in contribution as well. And so, I wouldn't say that, I want to clarify, I don't see that as the cause for where we are at this point in time. We're facing is a demographic issue, right? And even if we consider that the minimum pension increase, we also have to consider that the contribution rate also increased in those exact years as well. So I don't know if I answered your question, if you need any more.
All right, thank you very much for being for participating as the audience, and I really appreciate it. So now we're going to reach down basically to the end of the session. So I just want to ask each panelist if you just give us closing remarks. Andy, I'll start off with you if you want to give us any closing remarks before we leave.
Well, again, I think the theme of the conference says it well, balancing the equation, shaping a sustainable future.
Correct.
And basically, that's what we really have to do, at the NIBTT. We have our challenges. But we are engaging our stakeholders, and I'm confident that we will be able to see some changes that will be able to impact this issue, because this is emerging. It's a challenge. We have to understand that this challenge comes about because of our aging population. I think it's very important. Some people think that it's because of other issues. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we may focus on issues and say that, this issue is an investment issue. It's not an investment issue. I want to clarify that. The NIBTT will have to to get over 13% every year for the next 50 years in order to let investments make this go away. Some people may say that this is it's an expenditure issue from the other side, which is our administrative expenditure. I want to say it's not, because as we saw, the benefit expenditure of the system is 96%, and the administrative expenditure is less than 4%, and the actuarial review has said that we have actually one of the lowest administrative expenditure in the region. And so the crux of the matter is the aging population, and once we're able to make the appropriate reform measures and address the key issue, we're able to see a better balancing of the equation and a shaping of a more sustainable future.
Derek?
All right, so I'm going to take a word from Mariano, leadership, and I'm going to add the word maturity. Right? And I think it's going to take mature opposition, a mature minister and government, leaders of the unions and employers to get together, get around the table, and set some objectives and figure out a way to get there in a non-political way. And you can sell to your members, sell to the population, and make it happen. It's not a Trinidad issue. It's been faced all over the world. We saw France rioting the other day. We've seen Greece. Pensions have not been paid for several months when they had their problems many years ago. And we already have one country in the Caribbean who has been late on paying pensions. They have a cash crisis. And it's really, really hard for old people to look forward to that pension day, the same day every month, and be told, not today, and we're not sure when. Right? And so hopefully you never get to that point, but it will take maturity and take strong leadership to make sure you make the reforms that are necessary for long-term sustainability.
Well, there's not much to add where that is concerned. I think the point with regard to leadership and the maturity of the population as well. So that means that what we have to have is a communication mechanism and a communication plan. But first of all, we have to have a decision. If we don't recognize the problem for what it is, and it is a problem, and it is a systemic problem, and it requires us to start off with to say it is a problem which we must solve. At the level of political leadership, the answer to that is they've literally refused to recognize it as a problem, or grudgingly recognize it as a problem, or taking a long time to come to a conclusion and say, this is what we need to do, therefore this is what we need to address. And the point that I think we need to follow on from that, from the issue of sustainability, is that we not only need to look at the national insurance and the social security systems, but we have to look and balance the economy as a whole. And I cannot underestimate the importance of also looking and dealing with the pension rules as they apply to government. I think that's one of the critical issues we must also face as well.
Andy, Derek, Mariano, thank you very much for this panel discussion. I thought it was very interesting. I hope that you, our participants, would have gotten something out of it. So I just want to thank the panel. And thank you for joining us. And I hope you all have a successful conference and enjoy it to the max.
Thank you, Joel. Very good, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my goodness.